Layal by Christopher Sullivan. Read by Edana Minghella. The doorbell rang and Jane looked at her husband Phil. Their eyes met and a story was told. What choice do we have? She knew he was right. They had fostered so many children, but this child was different. Maybe it was a step too far. It was the TV programme which made up their minds. Jane opened the door where a lady stood waiting. "Hello, Jane," she said with a smile. "From the message I received, I gathered you wanted to speak to me urgently." "Come in," Jane replied, ushering her into the lounge where her husband was sitting. "Please take a seat, Mary. Can I offer you a drink?" Jane asked. "Tea would be good." Jane disappeared into the kitchen, her heart pounding. How could she send the child back? But as Phil said, what choice did they have? Mary opened her briefcase and pulled out a file. Jane came back with the tea and sat down next to her husband. Mary, who was looking down at paperwork, lifted her head and faced them. "So, what seems to be the problem?" Jane and Phil looked at each other, both embarrassed. Jane said softly, It's Layal. We don't..." Phil butted in. "We can't help her. You'll have to take her back." Mary glanced at both of them in turn. "You were told it was going to be difficult. Layal has had a traumatic life. She's suffered, seen more horrors than any child should ever see. From Syria to Calais, her life has been hell. If she is to recover, she needs love and stability." Jane faced her husband. Her eyes conveyed confusion. "Mary," Phil said, "Layal sits in her room staring at nothing. And when she's not doing that, she draws pictures that are horrific. I don't think she can recover." "Have you still got the drawings?" Mary asked. "Of course. Can I see them?" Phil jumped up, frustrated with himself for giving in too easily. After disappearing into another room, Phil returned, placing the drawings into Mary's hand. Thumbing through the pictures, they were everything that Phil had stated: brutal, horrific, and too graphic for an 11-year-old, except for one. Putting the others on the table and studying one in her hand, Mary looked around the room and read through her notes. "Layal, you took her into care back in early January, is that correct?" "Yes," they said in unison. Mary handed them the drawing and they both looked at the picture. "Would you say that the drawing resembles this room?" Mary asked. Jane looked up at her from the picture and stuttered, "Yes." "At that time you had not removed the Christmas decorations, is that correct?" Phil sat next to Jane and studied the picture. Sure enough, the image did not lie. True, it was basic, but it did show a room with a Christmas tree in the exact position it had been placed. "So?" Phil replied defiantly. "How does that help?" "Well," Mary said, "if you're prepared to give it another week or two and do as I suggest, you may be able to bring the young girl back from her nightmare. Clearly, if that doesn't work, we'll find her another home." "What are you proposing?" Phil replied. "There is a slim chance, and I have no evidence that this will work, for we know little of Layal's history other than that she can talk English. From the picture, it's clear that something about Christmas has somehow broken through her nightmare. My suggestion to you is to recreate this within the next few weeks and all that goes with it. Phil looked astonished. No, that will never work. It would be a pseudo-celebration. You cannot create a Christmas out of season. Mary smiled. Are you saying that the spirit of Christmas can only occur on the 25th of December? Surely the Christian message of goodwill to all people can and should be recreated any day of the year. Unfortunately, in this case, we don't have 8 months to wait. A young girl's sanity lies in the balance. Jane focused on her husband. I think Mary's got a point. It's worth a try. After all, up until this point, we have never given up on a child. Phil looked into his wife's eyes. You're serious, aren't you? It's doable, Phil said. However, I see a problem. How do we get her out of the bedroom? Jane thought about the problem. I know just the thing, she said, scribbling it down on the pad. Looking at it. Yes, that just might work. Let's do it, he replied. They smiled, got to their feet, and hugged each other. The idea had renewed their faith in helping Layal. Over the next 2 days, a date was confirmed, the 25th of April. They sent out invitations to relatives, particularly those with children, and Mary the social worker, explaining what they were doing and why. The tree was particularly difficult to source. After all, it wasn't Christmas. The big day arrived, and the downstairs lounge looked spectacular. The morning routine started exactly as any other morning. Jane went up to the girl's room, helped her dress, and changed the bed as normal. She then gave Layal her breakfast, but she picked at it. The girl said nothing, just stared out of the window. It felt like every other day. Jane and Phil had arranged to start the festivities at about 1 p.m, so they hoped to get Layal down by midday. They had picked up their secret yesterday, a small, fluffy, white puppy. It was a gamble. Taking the small bundle upstairs, they opened the bedroom door and let the puppy go. He immediately bounded towards the child. Layal looked down at the puppy and her eyes lit up. Beginning to stroke the dog, Layal seemed content. Jane and Phil left them together for 5 minutes. They then called the dog over, picked it up, and went downstairs, followed by Layal. She entered the lounge, and the puppy was sitting under the tree. Glancing at the dog and then around the room, something deep in her psyche began to stir. Nothing recent. It was further back, beyond the pain and brutality of her past life. It was a time beautiful and carefree, a time when her life was surrounded with love from family, friends, and her community, a time where hate did not exist. Layal selected the memory she was looking for. Her father's smile, so gentle and kind. Can I go to the party, Daddy? She asked, remembering her father musing over the question. Yes, he replied, they are good people. It is one of their religious celebrations, Christmas. Watch how they celebrate it, and maybe your friend can come to one of our festivities. Layal remembered walking into her friend's house, which was beautifully decorated for Christmas. Shortly afterwards, she lost touch with her friend, as hell came into her community. Phil looked down at the girl. Come on, let's switch the tree lights on. She followed. He flicked a switch, and the lights blazed into life. Layal gasped. The tree looked staggering, and a thin smile appeared across her face. She sat down under the tree, and the dog nuzzled up to her. Jane dropped to Layal's side. "What are you going to call this little fellow?" she asked. The girl remained quiet, gazed round the room. Phil was distracted by the doorbell. Within half an hour everyone had arrived. The grandchildren gathered around Layal and the dog. The girl was still quiet, but seemed much more relaxed, even smiling. Mary had a present in her hand. She went over to the girl and handed it to her. Slowly removing the package to reveal a rag doll, a smile appeared across her face. It was like the one her parents had brought her just before that party. She had cherished that doll. It had stayed with her through that nightmare of a journey until it was ripped from her by those who traffic people. Layal blanked that memory. It was too painful. The pre-Christmas party was in full swing. Layal's smile increased and lit up. She was so happy. The other children gathered round her and the puppy. It was magical. Jane and Phil kept their eye on her and felt pleased with themselves. The party food was laid out on the table and the children ran to it, including Layal. She, like the other children, gorged on the spread. And like the other children, she giggled. She was so happy. Layal gazed at Jane and Phil. They were deep in conversation with Mary. She walked over to them, followed by the dog. The prison of horror that she had shut out to protect her sanity was slowly melting away like ice. She knew there would be a time when she'd have to face it, but not today. This was a happy day. Layal clutched their hands. They both looked down in shock at the girl. Smiling, she said, "Will you be my mummy and daddy?" Both dropped to her level. "Yes," they replied, tears running down their faces. Mary watched. It was a vindication of her idea. Layal pulled away, dropped her gaze to the floor and said, "You won't ever leave me, will you?" "No," they both said in unison. The girl looked down at the dog. "I'm going to call him Christmas," she said, running off to play with the children. Jane and Phil stood up and dried their faces. Phil glared at Mary. "I never thought that would work." She smiled back and said, "That's the magic of Christmas, whatever time of year it is."